I see that we have Dr. Stotsky on the Skype, so she's up on our monitor. Before we begin, Ms. Stotsky, I'd like to give the group here a little bit of an introduction for you, if that's all right.
Of course.
Dr. Stotsky is credited with developing one of the country's strongest sets of academic standards for K through 12 students, as well as the strongest academic standards and licensure tests for prospective teachers while serving as Senior Associate Commissioner in the Massachusetts Department of Education from 1999 to 2003. She is also known nationwide for her in-depth analysis of the problems in Common Core's English Language Arts standards. Her current research ranges from the deficiencies in teacher preparation programs and teacher licensure tests to the deficiencies in the K through 12th reading curriculum and the question of gender bias in the curriculum. She is regularly invited to testify or submit testimony to state boards of education and state legislators on bills addressing licensure tests, licensure standards, and Common Core standards. She currently serves on several committees for the International Dyslexia Association and on the advisory board for Pioneer Institute Center for School Reform. She served on the National Validation Committee for the Common Core State Systemic Initiative from 2009 to 2010, on the National Mathematics Advisory Panel 2006-2008, and is co-authoring its final report as well as two of its task group reports on the Massachusetts Board of Elementary and Secondary Education. So with no further ado, we want to turn it over to Dr. Stotsky. It's good to have you here today. Thank you for coming and spending some time with us. So you have from now until 3 o'clock.
Until 3 o'clock, yes.
Yes, ma'am.
I'm on Eastern time, so I'm looking at 3:20 now, so that means until 4 o'clock my time. But that's certainly plenty. And I thank you very much for the introduction, and I am only regretful that I am not actually in Oklahoma to be with you in person. My talk will focus as cogently and as briefly as I can on the question of the costs involved in implementing the Common Core standards from the perspective of the quality of the standards, the quality of the assessments that you are getting for your money's worth, because the costs really must be looked at in terms of what are you getting for your money's worth. And most of my remarks will be directed towards the English Language Arts curriculum and the English Language Arts standards, because that is my area of expertise. Let me first detail the major issues with the English Language Arts standards that Oklahoma has voted to adopt from the Common Core standards. First of all, most of Common Core's college readiness and grade level reading standards are simply content-free skills. You're not buying very much content. There are a few standards that deal with seminal documents, but I have yet to see a sample testing item that even deals with them. So I am beginning to think that they are mainly there as window dressing. That is the first concern, that you have bought a whole bunch of skills, and skills training alone doesn't prepare students for college. They need a fund of content knowledge. Secondly, Common Core's standards stress writing more than reading at every grade level. And this is a serious issue because your teachers and your parents are going to notice that students are doing a lot more writing than they ever did. Sounds good at first, but the problem is that writing is dependent upon reading, and reading is being short-shrifted in several ways under the Common Core English Language Arts standards. It looks good to see that kids are going to be doing a lot more writing because we know they all need to learn how to do better writing, even when they're in college. But the basic problem, and it's a matter of research and common sense, is that good writing follows good reading, and you need an awful lot of good reading to internalize the structure of a good English sentence and to become a better writer. And if you simply count the standards, there are more writing than reading standards at every grade level. Third, we're getting to what English teachers need to do, which is at the high school level a serious problem. From K to 12, Common Core mandates in an unusual way that all the reading instruction that teachers give in the English or reading class must be divided between 10 informational reading standards and 9 literary standards. In K through 6, this is not a problem for the elementary teacher in a self-contained elementary classroom where she typically teaches all the other subjects over the course of the day. By the time you get to the subject-divided classroom day, which is very common in middle schools and is certainly the common way of dividing the school day in high school, this means that that one period of English per day, when the teacher is going to do reading, that teacher is going to address informational texts at least half the time from grade 9, from grade 6 to grade 12. Now, you do simple arithmetic. What this means is if you've added more informational, so-called informational text, you have lowered the amount of literary text that you are teaching. Now, some people think this might be a good idea. However, it is not a good idea if you are thinking about the development of critical thinking, which is something Common Core claims it is promoting. Critical thinking is developed in the English class by English teachers who teach students how to read between the lines. They develop a fund of knowledge in other areas, but the main way they learn to read between the lines is with complex literary texts. After all, they're not being taught to read between the lines for their science and history textbooks. Those are informational materials that students are supposed to learn from, not to question and read between the lines of. That's not their purpose. So by reducing literary study, complex literary study in the English class, and increasing something called informational text, which English teachers have never been trained to teach, you are reducing opportunities to develop critical thinking. Moreover, it opens the floodgate for all kinds of peculiar things called informational texts, little snippets of articles here and there that deal with computer nerds. I've seen these titles mentioned in curriculum sample materials, or other kinds of material on how teenagers are approached by commercial advertisers, things that aren't any part of a body of systematic information. The problem is that it fragments the English curriculum even more than it has been already, and it needed to be made more coherent rather than less coherent. The next issue is relating to Common Core's writing standards, which turn out to be developmentally inappropriate at many grade levels. I've been looking particularly at middle school, where the reading and the writing standards simply aren't coordinated. Little children are asked in grades 6, sometimes 5, to come up with a claim about something they are going to write that relates to a piece of reading. Most children that age don't know what a claim is. They might know what a baggage claim is, but they don't know what a claim, a piece of writing, is. And they're not given the appropriate reading materials if you look at what is in Common Core's reading standards. Even more recently, early childhood educators have been talking about the inappropriateness of the early childhood standards because it asks kindergarten students to do things that you would need far more mature children to do. So we have a lot of issues with various aspects of Common Core's standards, but let me summarize some of the major issues that came out of my being on the validation committee for Common Core. And I must tell you that I can't tell you what we did on that committee because we all had to sign confidentiality agreements at our first meeting. Yes, and I want to emphasize that I was certainly not prepared for a confidentiality agreement. I've been on many civic committees in my home community as an adult, all during my lifetime, and I was on the Massachusetts State Board of Education. We never signed confidentiality agreements, but that meant that we could never talk about what this committee did, any documents it might come out with, if it came out with any, but I can tell you about why I did not sign off at the end of the year when we were all asked to sign off on certain criteria for having been on this committee. I learned by that time, if not early, that we were expected to be basically rubber stamps. And I have never been a rubber stamp on any committee I've been on. I always ask questions. And we learned that basically that was all that was required of us. And I didn't sign on, nor did the only mathematician on the validation committee sign off either. We didn't sign off for the same reasons. That was first because Common Core standards are not internationally benchmarked or comparable to the best standards elsewhere. And you'd have to find out from CCSSO or the National Governors Association, the two groups that sponsored these standards, what countries they thought we were being benchmarked to, because we could never find out. So they are not benchmarked to comparable standards elsewhere. They lack a research base, and they also lack credible authors. This is something that the media should have picked up, but it didn't. Now, by a credible author, I mean, what are the credentials of the people who wrote the English language arts standards? We know who they were physically. They were Sue Pimentel and David Coleman. They're always regularly referred to as the chief architects of the English language arts standards by Common Core. Their lack of experience shows in every way. Neither of them had ever taught in K-12 or in higher ed. Neither of them had ever written any serious articles about curriculum and instruction or literary study, anything relating to the English language arts. Why they were chosen, we still don't know. All of this is confidential and material that can't even be FOIA'd because the two organizations that developed and sponsored the standards are private organizations, and they even benchmarked the standards so that your state of Oklahoma can't even change the standards. You can add 15% more to them, which will, of course, not be tested because the common tests will be based only on the standards these inexperienced people wrote. So those are the things you need to know about what you got for your money's worth when you adopted Common Core standards. Mainly skills, little content, and it seems to me that if you're implementing a set of standards, you are wasting your money if those standards are Common Cores. You're going to have to spend a lot of money on professional development for teachers, and it will be never-ending because, as we know from the research on professional development, there is almost no research suggesting the benefits of professional development in any content area. Unfortunately, states and local school districts spend a lot of money, often by law, on professional development. And when I was on the National Math Panel, we did an extensive review of the research, and there's almost no benefit from professional development. You're also going to be spending, as you already know, a lot of money on the technology for the assessments. We don't even know what their quality is. And here is where I want to start suggesting what Oklahoma, as well as all the other states I have testified in, should be thinking of doing. You should be asking your teaching faculty in your own institutions of higher education, University of Oklahoma and other institutions of higher education in your state, And I mean particularly the math, science, and engineering faculty that you have who teach undergraduates. They are the ones who should be examining the college readiness level of Common Core standards to see whether that is indeed what they agree with, or do they see problems in Common Core's college readiness level. I am still astonished that not one Board of Education, including Oklahoma's State Board of Education and Massachusetts State Board of Education, ever bothered to ask the teaching faculty at its own universities to look at these so-called college readiness standards and tell them what they thought about them. This is a serious gap, and you could, as a legislature, request your own higher ed teaching faculty not only to examine Common Cores capable of developing with your high school teachers of math, science, and English the right admissions test. They are, not somebody in Washington, not somebody connected to two private trade organizations who've copyrighted their standards. It makes no sense to me. And here is where you will get the quality you want for your state. They will want to work with your own high school teachers to develop the admissions tests that will make sense for what they know in teaching high school graduates of Oklahoma high schools. You would have one set of teaching faculty for math, science, and engineering with high school teachers of math and science, and then you might have a reading test developed by English teachers and literary scholars. Who better should know what is needed by Oklahoma high school students? One of the interesting observations I made, but no reporters seem to have made, when all the people on the standards development committees were announced by the National Governors Association and CCSSO, the observation was that there were no English professors or high school English teachers on any of these committees. There wasn't one on the validation committee. There wasn't one high school math teacher on the validation committee whose charge was to ensure that these standards were rigorous. How can elementary teachers decide how rigorous a set of high school math standards are? They wouldn't have been able to notice, as Professor Milgram has been able to notice, that there are no pre-calculus standards in Common Core and very few trigonometry standards. So lo and behold, despite the fact that we have been told by the current USED that everyone is concerned about STEM meaning science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, the pipeline to it, there is no pipeline to STEM majors at the college level from Common Core standards. So not only are you buying a flawed set of English standards, you're buying a damaging set of math standards because they will not prepare any of your high school students for a STEM four-year major in math or engineering or science or finance or business or any of the other majors that now require a higher level introductory mathematics course. This, to me, is astonishing and has not been commented on by CCSSO in its own Common Core documents or by all those who are so-called proponents of Common Core. How are you going to handle the STEM pipeline when the standards aren't even there? And the tests certainly won't cover, in the math part of the Common Core college readiness test, they won't cover the missing pieces because the test has to be based on what's there. So you have a serious problem. It's going to happen in your higher ed institutions once lower ed, K-12, has thoroughly adopted Common Core's mathematics standards. So I have two other short recommendations. If you want to have high-quality standards for K-12, certainly you are free for English language arts to use a version of the Massachusetts standards that I have made available without any charge on my homepage at the University of Arkansas. I have a complete document for English language arts standards for K-12 that anyone is free to adopt, adapt, revise, do anything with they want. For math, I would recommend that the state legislature consider recommending and paying for Singapore Math's original K-6 math series. There is no better series out on the market, and it has used in Singapore for students whose first language is not English. So it is designed for students whose first language is not English. It focuses on key quantitative terms. I think that's where I'm going to stop now because I really would like to hear whatever questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Stotsky. Let's see who's up. Representative Kern, do you have a question? Or?
I have several.
All right. Well, fire away with the first one.
Okay, Dr. Stotsky, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay, thank you. You talk about the cost for technology, and the test will be taken on these computers, and they're adaptive tests.
Right.
Can you explain what is meant by an adaptive test?
And a computer adaptive test means that when you do an item and it turns out to be a more difficult item for the child, the next couple of items or more that the child will be led to will be easier. If a child successfully handles one test item, then the next one may be more difficult. That's why it's called adaptive, because it goes according to whatever the child does on a particular test item. And it does mean that children across classrooms and across states may be working on different test items depending upon how successfully they've performed.
Follow up.
Sure.
So, in other words, when they say Common Core is to create a system so we can adequately compare one state to another, that's not really the case when you're using an adaptive test. How would that work?
It's going to be difficult. There are technical ways of trying to equate what happens, but it's certainly not going to be a straightforward comparison of the specific test items that have been done. Right now, if Oklahoma wants to know how its kids compare to other states, you already can do that through the National Assessment of Educational Progress tests. They give you, because that was required by No Child Left Behind in 2001, you have to take these every 2 years at a state level. It doesn't sample every child, just a random stratified sample, but you can see how many kids you have at the highest level of performance, at the lowest level of performance, and at two other categories in the middle. So you already have a sense of not only where your average is compared to the averages of other states and the whole country's average, but you also can see how many high performers and low performers you have. You already can do that for getting a picture, a snapshot, a profile of your own state performance. So I don't know how much more information you're going to be able to get from the claims by Common Core and what good it'll do you. I mean, why would you want to know where you stand in relation to, say, North Carolina or South Carolina? What good will that do your teachers?
Okay,
I don't know.
One more question on adaptive testing, and then I'll get out of the queue and let somebody else, but I have more. Okay, will adaptive testing have any impact on the achievement gap?
We really don't know yet because it hasn't taken place and there have been no pilot studies. One of our major problems with Common Core a psychometric point of view is that we simply don't know what's going to happen because there is absolutely no piloting of any of the items. And so we don't know what's going to happen at all. And we can't tell if the gap will be closed or whether it might even be widened. Either is a possibility.
Then I have a follow-up to this same question. Okay, one thing I've heard is since you take two students who are taking a test, one of them answers the first question correctly, the other student does not. The one that answered the question correctly will get a little bit harder question for the next one. The one who did not answer the first question correctly will get a little bit easier question.
Right.
So will this not in some way cause those smarter students to not score as high and those lower students to perhaps score a little bit higher, and so therefore it looks like there has been a shrinking in the achievement gap between the higher levels and lower levels?
We don't know yet. The effects on students are really unknown because none of this has been piloted with information given to the public or to the rest of us who are interested. Sometimes it may be possible to think that students who tackle a harder item will find it easier to get it wrong and then have easier items to get right. You know, we just don't know how to psych it out yet. At least I'm not sure that I know of anyone who has figured out how large numbers of kids are going to handle all of this and the effect on their psychology. This is all unknown territory, and it's just too bad this hasn't been piloted. This particular method of assessment has been piloted. The standards haven't been piloted. Nothing's been piloted. We have a whole nation of guinea pigs for children.
Before I go to Senator Sharp, Dr. Stotsky, if I'm getting it correctly, I want to ask this question this way. Is Common Core a lot like the Affordable Care Act, otherwise known as Obamacare, that we're actually rolling it out before it's even ready? I mean, before it's even finished, and we don't even know if it will work, and even if it works partially, we don't know the effect that it will have. I mean, are we looking at the same kind of thing?
There are many parallels that people are drawing between the two different focuses, one on health care, one on education. I can't speak to health care because I haven't focused on the details, but it is the case that we are rolling out a lot of regulations and restrictions and strings that are being attached, including data collection, which nobody expected because it wasn't in the original Common Core document, but goes along with the testing that's going to be done and the money that is being given to states and to other groups by the Gates Foundation, which is interested in promoting the standards, the assessments, and the data collection, which may lend itself to workforce questions that can be answered once you have massive data. But we don't know. The question is a very good one. The approach is similar in that you do things on a grand scale and then worry about the consequences later.
Senator Sharp.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Stotsky, my question is here in Oklahoma recently, this Oklahoma State Department of Education has withdrawn Oklahoma from this 22-state consortium, and yet it is being stated that we're staying within Common Core standards. What rationale? This sounds a little bit about fuzzy politics to me. So what would be your comment to that?
I'm sorry, I really didn't hear the last part of your question.
Well, again, this sounds a little bit about fuzzy politics. Whenever we're taking from this 22-state consortium as Common Core is being able to compare our state to other states' benchmarks, what would be the rationale of us as Oklahoma withdrawing from this 22-state consortium of Common Core and then creating and yet still maintaining our own Common Core standards? Is there any rationale there?
If I understand your question, I'll just repeat it. What would be the rationale, or what would you gain by withdrawing from the consortium and developing your own standards? You would certainly gain more control over what you're doing at the state level and at the local level. And from my knowledge of Oklahoma, I was in Arkansas for 5.5 years, and I would say that probably the thinking would be similar among people in both of those states. You want to have more parental involvement and response by schools to what parents are doing or how they see their responsibilities as parents. So you would gain by withdrawing from a consortium that may not allow you to vet or control or alter or change. After all, if you have any problems as a state with any of the standards or the test items, to whom do you complain as a state? You have to get all the other states to agree. It's not clear to me that it's going to get Oklahoma much, if anything, except tangled up with a lot of other states. You do need good standards, but that is a process that needs to be handled at the state level because we certainly didn't get it at the national level. So you would have more opportunity to work out better standards at the local level, and teacher licensing and teacher program approval at the state level, which is where it is situated legally. It is not, teacher licensing and program approval are not done by the federal government, and that is where you really do need to start, particularly at the elementary school level. That's a whole other talk, in a sense, or an area that we can't go into a lot of detail, but if you really want to start improving your schools, and I've said this in testimony to many states, you need to start with raising the academic bar for your prospective elementary teacher and making sure that you have a sound approach to the teaching of reading in your elementary schools. All the rest will follow much better once you can start working on that piece of it. The standards come second, in a sense, but you need to have a higher caliber, academically speaking, elementary or early childhood teacher, and you need to make sure that they are teaching the best that we know for the teaching of reading. And that isn't part of Common Core. So you're not gaining any of that, and you can do that on your own as a state.
Dr. Stotsky, let me redirect the question.
Yes.
What sense would it make to remove ourselves from the consortium but still try to implement Common Core? If we stuck with trying to implement Common Core but we remove ourselves from the other 22 states, what sense does that make?
You still have to have state tests under No Child Left Behind. As I understand the legal situation, even if you got a waiver, you would still have to have a state test. That was under No Child Left Behind. It was a requirement. So either way, you do have to give a state test, and the test must be based on the standards that you have. So if you are keeping Common Core standards, and in English they're mainly skills, and in math they're going to be very low level for the college readiness test, I'm not sure what you're gaining from staying in the consortium. Remember, you're paying for the costs of implementing the test as well as for implementing the curriculum, implementing the standards in the form of whatever curriculum you choose. So you don't gain anything, and I think that was the direction you were going in. If you get out of the consortium and still keep Common Core standards, you haven't given yourself any advantage because you still have to have a state test.
Did that help?
Yes, thank you.
Representative Kern, I think you had other questions.
Yes, sir, I do, if no one else.
We'll
Okay.
fire away one, and then we'll see if any others get in the queue.
Thank you. Dr. Stotsky, it's common knowledge that not only in Oklahoma, but pretty well all over the nation, we have a reading deficiency in our schools. And why is that so? And does Common Core address that? And will Common Core help that at all, in your opinion?
Common Core will not address it any better, the reading problem than your own standards that you have would. What will address it would be changes, as I just mentioned, I won't go over them, to raising the academic bar for those who go into your education schools and making sure that your licensure test requires your schools of education to teach the right stuff for them. But Common Core won't have anything to do with it one way or the other. It has one strand of foundational skills. I think they're either called fundamental or foundational skills that are very good. But they also have other strands and other kinds of standards in K-5. And it will all depend on what your prospective elementary teacher is taught and what the professional development provider tells these teachers to do in their classrooms, so that you may not be able, and by you, I mean your children in your schools may not be able to benefit from that foundational skills strand if it is smothered by other things, a guessing approach, as I would call it, just to simplify matters. Instead of a decoding analytical approach to beginning reading, and I'm talking about beginning reading, you have a guessing approach. That was one of the things I addressed very square on in Massachusetts. We developed a first-class licensure test for reading and made sure that new teachers as well as professional development providers, when reading first existed, were going to be given the right kinds of professional development and the right approaches to use in the classroom. We think it showed up in the fact that within a few years on NAEP tests, National Assessment of Educational Progress tests, Massachusetts kids went to become first in the country on grade 4 and grade 8 in reading. It's not clear that you can make a tight cause and effect relationship because there are too many variables and factors that affect what kids do in school, but we were able to get more teachers to do the right kind of things in the early grades. But this is something we did on a state level. Whether Common Core can even be that good, we don't know. It hasn't been tried anywhere.
Okay, thank you. Another question I have, you said good writing follows good reading, and the students under Common Core will be asked to do a lot more writing and less reading. So are you saying that the standards do not follow a good progression, a developmental progression?
Right, right.
Is
saying the emphasis is wrong in Common Core, and the Massachusetts standards, which, as I say, could be seen as one kind of a model because of what happened in the Bay State, are the opposite. If you have more writing than reading standards and teachers spend more time on writing than reading, you're not really going to see the kind of gains that you want. If you have a heavy emphasis on good reading, and I'm talking now about all kinds of reading, broad reading, literary reading, listening to good stories, and so on, better writing is apt to come about later on because students have internalized the vocabulary of complex literature, the technical vocabulary in whatever informational reading they have done. But it's not, it doesn't sound intuitive to say you need to emphasize reading rather than writing if you want to see better writing. But we know from 100 years of research in reading, and we know what good writers will always tell you, that good reading is what matters more. You need to do some writing. I am not saying that you will automatically get good writing if you just do good reading. No, you need to practice writing just as you need to practice sports or anything else. You can't do something you don't practice at all. But the basis for it is what children internalize, the reading. And so what Common Core is doing is going in the wrong direction because it was written by people who had good intentions but didn't understand the dynamics of the curriculum.
Okay, thank you. One last question. I think it's my last one.
Sure.
I had the opportunity of being in D.C. about 2 weeks ago and hearing a conference that dealt largely with Common Core. And a gentleman, I don't know if you've heard of him or not, Dr. Terrence Moore from Hillsdale College up in Michigan. He spoke.
I've heard him speak, yes.
He's a history teacher, but he has been buying the Common Core textbooks for English Lit, and looking at the way they are handling historical content in the literary textbooks. And he ended his talk with the statement that Common Core is superficial, politically biased, anti-American, anti-family, and anti-religion. Do you have any comment on that statement?
These are his observations. He is a well-learned professor. I would not comment on what he has to say because he gives examples of what he's talking about.
Yeah, he gave some awesome examples.
We have another question, Senator Sharp.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Stotsky, someone stands to make a lot of money off this implementation of Common Core, don't they?
You're right.
And what would be your estimated cost of this implementation of this Common Core? What is your research? Do you have any figures that you might be able to estimate as to what the overall cost?
Okay. It wasn't coming through clearly, but I think I got the gist of what you were asking for. I can't give you specific figures because the ones that I have heard, and I keep going to conferences and meetings where different figures come up, and everyone says the costs are going to be far greater than we have heard so far. It might be $50 per child, if that's the kind of figure you're talking about. Overall, at a recent conference last week, someone who's looked into the costs has said it may cost nationally $16 billion. So it depends on what you're looking at, what you're counting as part of the cost. It's going to be big money, far more. Remember, you have to have a dedicated room in a school and in every school with computers that probably are set aside for the testing purposes, and someone in charge of that room to make sure that there are no glitches that happen or to handle anything that comes up. So there are going to be personnel costs, there will be maintenance costs, there will be things that we may not even anticipate at this time. It's very difficult to know what the final bill is going to be. But as far as we know from the very beginning, technology testing companies have been very eager to promote Common Core. And I noticed that the Standards Development Committee and a good number of the people on the Validation Committee were associated with testing companies. I draw my own conclusion from who was chosen to be on the committees.
Dr. Stotsky, let me ask you this. We're running out of time, so this may be our last question. Would it make sense for someone to say that a state could implement this without it costing anything?
No State Board of Ed did a cost-benefit analysis, which was ultimately to be to their sorrow because it couldn't cost nothing. If it's going to mean anything at all, there's got to be professional development and training for teachers and new materials. Now, you might say that substitutes for what they would have bought anyway, but if this is supposed to be a radical transformation, which is what some people have claimed who support it, it has to cost something more than what you've planned for. And the question is, what are you getting for your money's worth? Do you know what you're getting for your money's worth? Has to cost something. Anyone who says that it costs nothing simply doesn't know how schools and education policy work.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Stotsky. We appreciate your time. You have done a fabulous job. Thank you so much for spending your time with us today, and we appreciate it so very, very much.